The name Dzungar people, also written as Zunghar, referred to the several Oirat tribes who formed and maintained the Dzungar Khanate in the 17th and 18th centuries. Historically, they were one of major tribes of the Four Oirat confederation. They were also known as the Eleuths or Ööled, from the Qing dynasty, euphemism for the hated word Dzungar, and also called Kalmyks. In 2010, 15,520 people claimed Ööled ancestry in Mongolia. An unknown number also live in China, Russia, and Kazakhstan. Origin: the Dzungars were a confederation of several Oirat tribes that emerged in the early 17th century to fight the Altan Khan of the Kaka, the Jizatu Khan, and later the Manchu for dominion and control over the Mongolian people and territories. This confederation rose to power in what became known as Dzungaria between the Altai Mountains and the Ili River Valley. Initially, the confederation consisted of the Ööled, Dorbe and Khoi tribes. Later on, elements of the Koshut and Torgut tribes were forcibly incorporated into the Dzungar military, thus completing the reunification of the West Mongolian tribes. According to oral history, the Ööled and Dorbe tribes are the successor tribes to the Naiman, a Mongol tribe that roamed the steppes of Central Asia during the era of Genghis Khan. The Ööled shared the clan name Khoros with the Dorvod. Zunghar and Barungar formed the Oirat's military and administrative organization. The Dzungar Ööleds and Khoros became the ruling clans in the 17th century. History: in 1697, two relatives of Gildan Boshutu Khan, Danjila and Radan, surrendered to the King Kangxi Emperor. The people were then organized into two Ulodbanas and resettled in modern Bangkongor Province, Mongolia. In 1731, 500 households fled back to Dzungar territory while the remaining Ööleds were deported to Ulaanbaatar. After 1761, some of them were resettled in Arkhangai Province. The Dzungars, who lived in an area that stretched from the west end of the Great Wall of China to present-day eastern Kazakhstan and from present-day northern Kyrgyzstan to southern Siberia, were the last nomadic empire to threaten China, which they did from the early 17th century through the middle of the 18th century. After a series of inconclusive military conflicts that started in the 1680s, the Dzungars were subjugated by the Manchu-led Qing dynasty in the late 1750s. Clark argued that the Qing campaign in 1757–58 amounted to the complete destruction of not only the Dzungar state but of the Dzungars as a people. Quote, after the Qianlong Emperor led Qing forces to victory over the Dzungar Oirat Mongols in 1755, he originally was going to split the Dzungar Khanate into four tribes headed by four Khans. The Khoi tribe was to have the Dzungar leader Amur Sana as its Khan. Amur Sana rejected the Qing arrangement and rebelled since he wanted to be leader of a united Dzungar nation. Qianlong then issued his orders for the genocide and eradication of the entire Dzungar nation and name. King Manchu Bannerman and Kaka Mongols enslaved Dzungar women and children while slaying the other Dzungars. The Qianlong Emperor then ordered the genocide of the Dzungars, moving the remaining Dzungar people to the mainland and ordering the generals to kill all the men in Bakhola Suzho, and divided the wives and children to Qing forces, which were made out of Manchu Bannerman and Kaka Mongols. King scholar Wei Yuan estimated the total population of Dzungars before the fall at 600,000 people, or 200,000 households. Oirat officer Saril betrayed and battled against the Oirats. In a widely cited account of the war, Wei Yuan wrote that about 40% of the Dzungar households were killed by smallpox, 20% fled to Russia, Kazakh tribes, and 30% were killed by the Qing army of Manchu Bannerman and Kaka Mongols, leaving no yurts in an area of several thousands li except those of the surrendered During this war, Kazakhs attacked dispersed Oirats and Eleuths. Based on this account, when Zhang Chu wrote that 80% of the 600,000 or more Dzungars were destroyed by disease, an attack which Michael Clark described as the complete destruction of not only the Dzungar state but of the Zunghars as a people. Historian Peter Perdue attributed the decimation of the Dzungars to an explicit policy of extermination launched by Qianlong, but he also observed signs of a more lenient policy after mid-1757. Mark Levena, a historian whose recent research interests focus on genocide, has stated that the extermination of the Dzungars was arguably the 18th century genocide par excellence. The Dzungar genocide was completed by a combination of a smallpox epidemic and the direct slaughter of Dzungars by Qing forces made out of Manchu, Bannerman and Mongols. Anti-Dzungar Uyghur rebels from the Turfan and Hami oases had submitted to Qing rule as vassals and requested Qing help for overthrowing Dzungar rule. Uyghur leaders like Emin Collier were granted titles within the Qing nobility, and these Uyghurs helped supply the Qing military forces during the anti-Dzungar campaign. The Qing employed Collier Emin in its campaign against the Dzungars and used him as an intermediary with Muslims from the Tarim Basin to inform them that the Qing were only aiming to kill Dzungars and that they would leave the Muslims alone, and also to convince them to kill the Dzungars themselves and side with the Qing, since the Qing noted the Muslims' resentment of the former experience under Dzungar rule at the hands of Suwang Arapan. It was not until generations later that Dzungaria rebounded from the destruction and near liquidation of the Dzungars after the mass slayings of nearly 1 million Dzungars. Historian Peter Perdue has shown that the decimation of the Dzungars was the result of an explicit policy of extermination launched by Qianlong. Perdue attributed the decimation of the Dzungars to a deliberate use of massacre and has described it as an ethnic genocide. Although this deliberate use of massacre has been largely ignored by modern scholars, Mark Levena, a historian whose recent research interests focus on genocide, has stated that the extermination of the Dzungars was arguably the 18th century genocide par excellence. The Qing final solution of genocide to solve the problem of the Dzungars made the Qing-sponsored settlement of millions of Han Chinese, Hui, Turkestani oasis people and Manchu Bannerman in Dzungaria possible, since the land was now devoid of Dzungars. The Dzungarian basin, which used to be inhabited by Dzungars, is currently inhabited by Kazakhs. In northern Xinjiang, the Qing brought in Han, Hui, Uyghur, Xibe, and Kazakh colonists after they exterminated the Dzungar Oirat Mongols in the region, with 1/3 of Xinjiang's total population consisting of Hui and Han in the northern area, while around 2/3 were Uyghurs in southern Xinjiang's Tarim Basin. In Dzungaria, the Qing established new cities like Urumqi and Yanning. The Qing were the ones who unified Xinjiang and changed its demographic situation. The depopulation of northern Xinjiang after the Buddhist Oirats were slaughtered led to the Qing settling Manchu, Sibo, Dors, Solons, Han Chinese, Hui Muslims, and Turkic Muslim Taranchis in the north, with Han Chinese and Hui migrants making up the greatest number of settlers. Since it was the crushing of the Buddhist Ööled by the Qing which led to promotion of Islam and the empowerment of the Muslim begs in southern Xinjiang, and migration of Muslim Taranchis to northern Xinjiang, it was proposed by Henry Schwartz that the Qing victory was, in a certain sense, a victory for Islam. Xinjiang as a unified defined geographic identity was created and developed by the Qing. It was the Qing who led to Turkic Muslim power in the region increasing since the Mongol power was crushed by the Qing, while Turkic Muslim culture and identity was tolerated or even promoted by the Qing. Qianlong explicitly commemorated the Qing conquest of the Dzungars as having added new territory in Xinjiang to China, defining China as a multi-ethnic state, rejecting the idea that China only meant Han areas in China proper, meaning that according to the Qing, both Han and non-Han peoples were part of China, which included Xinjiang, which the Qing conquered from the Dzungars. After the Qing were done conquering Dzungaria in 1759, they proclaimed that the new land, which formerly belonged to the Dzungars, was now absorbed into China in a Manchu language memorial. The Qing expounded on their ideology that they were bringing together the outer, non-Han Chinese like the Inner Mongols, Eastern Mongols, Oirat Mongols, and Tibetans together with the inner Han Chinese into one family, united in the Qing state, showing that the diverse subjects of the Qing were all part of one family. The Qing used the phrase Zhong Waiyijia or Ne Waiyijia to convey this idea of unification of the different peoples. In the Manchu official Tlisen's Manchu language account of his meeting with the Torgid leader Ayuka Khan, it was mentioned that while the Torgids were unlike the Russians, the people of the Central Kingdom were like the Torgid Mongols, and the people of the Central Kingdom referred to the Manchus. The Hulanbu Ööleds formed an administrative banner along the Imin and Shinkan rivers. During the Qing dynasty, a body of them resettled in Yakashi city. In 1764 many Ööleds migrated to Kovd province in Mongolia and supplied corvée services for the Kovd garrison of the Qing. The number reached 9,100 in 1989. A united administrative unit was demanded by them. The Dzungars remaining in Xinjiang were also renamed Ööleds. They dominated 30 of the 148 Mongol sums during the Qing dynasty era and numbered 25,000 in 1999.